Welcome to the Deep Dive, your shortcut to being truly well-informed.
Today, we're plunging into a topic that feels, well, more urgent than ever, the state of global peace.
Yeah, you probably sense it, right? We're constantly bombarded with news about conflict, but it's incredibly difficult to step back and, understand the larger forces at play.
It really is. It's so easy to get caught in the daily headlines, which often just focus on individual flashpoints.
Exactly.
So our goal for you today is to pull back a bit, see the wider canvas, and understand the profound shifts shaping peace, or, well, the increasing lack of it across the globe.
And to do that, we're taking a deep dive into the 2024 Global Peace Index, or GPI. It's published by the Institute for Economics and Peace, the IEP.
The IEP, they're a really remarkable organization.
They really are. Independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit. Basically a think tank dedicated entirely to understanding and measuring peace.
And their whole aim is to shift the global conversation, right? Towards peace as a positive, measurable thing, like actual human well-being, not just the absence of war.
Precisely. They're trying to quantify something that often feels, well, beyond measure.
Yeah, and their rigorous approach helps us move beyond just the narratives, to really grasp the underlying structures that either foster peace or, unfortunately, allow conflict to take root.
That's a crucial distinction. Okay, so our mission for you in this deep dive, let's unpack what's genuinely happening to global peacefulness.
And how conflict itself is fundamentally transforming in the 21st century. That's key.
Absolutely. Plus, the immense, frankly, staggering economic costs involved. And maybe most importantly, explore a unique framework for building lasting peace that offers a real path forward.
We'll definitely highlight some surprising facts and critical insights that hopefully cut through some of the noise.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with the big picture. And it's quite a stark one.
It is. The 2024 GPI reveals that the world became less peaceful for the 5th consecutive year.
5 years in a row. Just think about that for a second.
And even more broadly, it's the 12th time in the last 16 years that global peacefulness has deteriorated.
Wow. But here's the headline that really caught my attention. The world isn't just less peaceful overall. It's becoming fundamentally unequal in its peacefulness.
That's precisely it. 65 countries did see some improvement.
Which is good, I guess.
Yeah, but nearly 100 countries actually experienced a deterioration. And what's truly striking is that the gap between the most and least peaceful countries, it's now wider than at any point in the index's history.
So this isn't just a statistical blip.
Not at all. It paints a picture of a deepening divide where peace becomes an increasingly concentrated privilege, not a universal state.
That idea of peace inequality, that's a powerful concept. But how exactly do they measure something as complex as peace? It's not just a gut feeling, is it?
Oh, definitely not. It's a robust composite index. Uses 23 different indicators.
23, okay.
Yeah, and they're grouped into 3 key domains: ongoing conflict, societal safety and security, and militarization.
Right, so like a comprehensive health check.
Yeah.
Looking at everything from, say, homicide rates to weapons imports.
Exactly. All things that measure the absence of violence or, importantly, the fear of violence. Then an expert panel assigns weightings.
How does that work?
Well, they give 60% to internal peace and 40% to external peace. The thinking is that a stable society internally is often more peaceful externally.
And I read that the IEP found the GPI is actually as robust as the Human Development Index, the HDI,
Yeah.
which is a major global standard.
That's right. They found that 70% of pairwise country comparisons hold true regardless of the specific weighting scheme used.
That gives you real confidence in the results, doesn't it?
It does. Now, if we look long-term, since 2008, the ongoing conflict domain has deteriorated significantly by about a fifth, actually.
Wow.
And societal safety and security by a smaller amount, about 1.7%. Militarization was the only domain that showed overall improvement historically. But that trend has actually reversed recently.
Interesting. And for 2024 specifically, any big shifts?
Yeah, the largest deterioration was, maybe surprisingly, on UN peacekeeping funding.
Really? That seems counterintuitive.
It does, doesn't it? While the biggest improvement was on the violent demonstrations indicator. Fewer large-scale violent protests, perhaps.
That shift in UN peacekeeping funding is certainly something to think about, especially as we see conflict evolving. How does this all play out regionally? Are there any surprising pockets of, improvement or deterioration?
Absolutely. Let's look at Europe. It remains the most peaceful region, home to 7 of the 10 most peaceful countries. Still the benchmark in many ways.
Okay, that sounds about right.
However, it recorded its largest year-on-year deterioration on the militarization domain since the GPI started back in 2008.
So even the most peaceful region is feeling the pressure to militarize more.
Exactly. While Europe remains peaceful overall, this increase in military spending, the buildup, especially responding to conflicts like Ukraine, it highlights a pretty profound shift in its security approach.
That makes sense. And on the other end of the spectrum.
The Middle East and North Africa, MNA, it continues to be the least peaceful region, hosts 4 of the 10 least peaceful countries.
Including Sudan and Yemen.
Sudan and Yemen, right at the bottom, the 2 least peaceful globally.
Grim.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Russia and Eurasia. That was the only region to see an improvement in peacefulness last year.
Wait, really? An improvement despite the war in Ukraine?
Yeah, an increase of just over 0.5%. Now, obviously, the Ukraine conflict is huge, but the biggest improvement within that region actually came from Kazakhstan. They saw a significant rise in their score.
That's genuinely counterintuitive. How does the GPI account for that? What does it tell us about how peace is measured?
It just highlights the nuance, right? While a major conflict like Ukraine heavily hits the overall global score,
Sure.
specific internal improvements or maybe reduce smaller conflicts in other parts of a large region can sometimes lead to an overall regional improvement, statistically. Peace isn't monolithic, even within one area.
I see. Okay. What about other regions?
While moving south, South America saw the second largest fall in peacefulness, about a 3.6% deterioration.
Oof. Anywhere in particular?
Ecuador especially, a dramatic deterioration there due to, well, rampant drug and gang violence. Its homicide rate might be as high as 45 per 100,000 people.
45. That's incredibly high.
It is. But on the flip side, Peru actually showed some improvement in South America.
Okay. And a quick note on South Asia.
Ah, yes. Bhutan continues its impressive run, still the most peaceful country in that region since 2011.
Good for Bhutan. Okay, now let's shift gears and talk about how conflict itself is evolving. Because it's not just more widespread, its very nature seems to be changing.
That's absolutely right. The report highlights that 92 countries are now engaged in conflict beyond their borders.
92. That's the most since the GPI began in 2008, yes.
And it makes negotiation processes, trying to find lasting peace, much, much more complex.
So what's driving this internationalization?
2 main things, really. Increased great power competition, think U.S., China, Russia, and the rise of middle powers becoming much more active regionally.
Okay, so we're seeing that clear shift from maybe a U.S.-dominated world.
In unipolar world, yeah.
To something much more multipolar.
Definitely. And this intensifies competition. It prolongs conflicts because traditional powers like the U.S. and the EU are kind of stretched thin.
Right, and while they're stretched.
Emerging powers like China and Russia, plus those regional middle powers, think Turkey, UAE, others, they're increasingly vying for influence in these conflict zones.
You can see that reflected, can't you? Like France pulling out of Mali and Niger.
Exactly. And the U.S. leaving bases in Niger and Chad, it creates these vacuums.
Which are sometimes filled by what? Private military companies?
Sometimes, yeah. Or other regional actors. It's a much messier geopolitical landscape.
And this messiness directly impacts the rise of asymmetric warfare and technology, right?
Absolutely. The nature of conflict is changing because non-state groups can now engage far more effectively with larger states. They're using readily available tech.
Like drones and IEDs.
Drones and improvised explosive devices, exactly. The statistics on drones are just eye-opening.
Tell me about them.
Use of drones by non-state groups surged by over 1,400% since 2018.
1,400%.
Yeah. In 2023 alone, nearly 5,000 drone strikes, up from just over 400 in 2018, resulting in over 3,000 deaths.
And these are often cheap, commercially available drones being weaponized.
Often, yes. We see rebel groups in Myanmar using them, apparently relying on online instructions and parts from neighboring China sometimes.
And Ukraine, of course. They basically pioneered a whole drone warfare branch of their military.
They did. It really redefines what military capability even means now.
How so?
Well, despite a general decline in military personnel, 112 countries reduced their personnel rates between 2008 and 2024.
Okay.
Global military capability has actually increased by 10% since 2014.
So fewer soldiers, but more potent forces.
Precisely. Driven almost entirely by technology. IEP has this new machine learning method to assess it, looking at both quantity and, crucially, the quality of military assets.
Who's leading the pack there?
Well, the U.S. still holds a strategic advantage, maybe 3 times the capabilities of its nearest rival. China. But China has seen the most significant increase in overall military capabilities since 2014. They're closing the gap technologically.
It really is a new era of warfare. More tech, maybe more distance, but also, frankly, more brutal outcomes sometimes.
Which leads us to this idea of forever wars. Battle deaths reached a 30-year high in 2022.
30 years.
And the total number of conflicts is now higher than at any point since World War II.
That's a sobering statistic. What are the key examples driving this?
Well, obviously the Russia-Ukraine conflict, over 2,000 fatalities per month, almost every month for the past 2 years, and neither side seems to be making significant gains. It's a brutal stalemate.
And Gaza.
The Gaza conflict, over 35,000 deaths since October 2023, a severe humanitarian crisis, and the report notes that negative sentiment between Israelis and Palestinians has been steadily rising since way back in 2007.
Long before this latest escalation.
Exactly. And the report raises the very real prospect of this war spreading, pointing to those direct Israel-Iran attacks and Hezbollah's significant rocket capabilities in Lebanon.
What's also deeply concerning is how conflicts are actually ending, or rather, how they're not ending.
That's a huge point. Decisive victories for either side, they've fallen dramatically, from almost 50% in the 1970s to less than 9% in the 2010s.
Less than 1 in 10 and decisively. And peace agreements.
Also plummeted from 23% down to a mere 4%.
So if conflicts aren't ending in clear victories or peace deals, how are they ending?
That's the critical question. Nearly 70% of conflicts in the 2010s ended as low activity, meaning fewer than 25 deaths per year, but with no clear resolution, no peace deal, no surrender. They just kind of simmer.
Looking frozen conflicts.
Exactly. Frozen conflicts that are likely to erupt again, leaving this legacy of instability.
And even when victories do occur, the cost.
Oh, the cost is devastating, human and economic. Look at Syria, an 85% drop in GDP, just staggering.
Or Sri Lanka.
Sri Lanka, yeah. Between 40,000 and 70,000 civilian deaths estimated in just the final stages of its civil war.
It's a brutal reminder that, victory doesn't always mean peace or stability. Far from it sometimes.
And while Ukraine and Gaza rightly get a lot of attention.
They dominate the headlines.
Yeah. The report underscores that many other severe conflicts go tragically unnoticed. The unseen conflicts.
Right. Talk about those. Myanmar, for instance.
Myanmar, yeah. Since the 2021 military coup, the conflict has escalated dramatically. Armed groups now control nearly 40% of the country's territory.
40%.
And over 3,000 deaths from internal conflict just in 2023. It's a clear example of an internal conflict spiraling with minimal global focus.
In the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC.
Decades of conflict there. Over 5.6 million people displaced internally. You have the M23 rebel group, reportedly backed by Rwanda.
With troops and arms.
Reportedly, yes. Controlling areas rich in resources like coltan. It highlights that complex link between conflict and resources.
And isn't the UN peacekeeping mission leaving?
It is. MONUSCO, the world's largest peacekeeping mission, is withdrawing due to perceived ineffectiveness, which is quite something.
That is shocking. What else?
Nagorno-Karabakh. Azerbaijan's military offensive in September 2023 led to the flight of roughly 100,000 Karabakh Armenians.
With very little international attention.
Minimal. As Russia seemed unwilling to enforce the previous peace deal, and then there's Haiti.
Haiti, yes. What's the situation there?
Gang violence has just escalated dramatically. Violent criminal groups control nearly half the country and over 90% of the capital, Port-au-Prince.
90% of the capital.
Schools, medical facilities, closed due to extreme violence. These stories just underscore how complex, deep-rooted, and tragically ignored many of these unseen wars really are.
And all these factors, the prolonged wars, the unseen conflicts, the instability, they contribute to a grim global reality.
Yeah.
Mass displacement.
Huge numbers. Over 95 million people are now either refugees or internally displaced because of violent conflict.
95 million. It's hard to even comprehend that number.
It really is. To give you... displaced.
5%.
Examples. In Gaza, it's almost 75% of the population internally displaced right now.
3/4.
And in Syria, a staggering 56.7% of the entire population is either internally displaced or refugees in other countries. More than half the nation.
The human cost is just immeasurable. But the economic cost, that's something the IEP meticulously tries to quantify, right?
They do, and the numbers are, well, truly staggering.
Hit me with it.
In 2023, the economic impact of violence on the global economy was $19.1 trillion.
$19.1 $19.1 trillion in
Yeah.
PPP terms, right? Purchasing power parity.
Yes, in PPP terms,
Yeah.
which allows for better comparison across countries.
Okay, $19.1 trillion. How do we put that in perspective for you, our listener?
Well, it's equivalent to about 13.5% of the world's total economic activity.
13.5%.
Or, maybe more relatable, $2,380 for every single person on the planet.
Wow. Think about that. Over a tenth of all global economic activity diverted away from progress just to deal with conflict and its containment. Where does most of that money actually go?
The biggest chunks. Military and internal security spending, they account for over 74% of that $19.1 trillion total.
3/4 of it.
Yeah. Military spending alone was $8.4 trillion last year. And what's particularly striking is the trend. The overall impact of violence, in real terms, is nearly 7.5% higher in 2023 compared to 2008.
So it's consistently going up. It's not a one-off bad year.
No, it's a consistent upward trend, and the GDP losses for specific countries are devastating.
We mentioned Syria's 85% drop. What about Ukraine?
Ukraine's economy shrank by an estimated 30% in 2022 alone because of the invasion, just wiped out nearly a third of its economy.
And which countries bear the highest relative cost as a percentage of their own GDP?
In 2023, that was Ukraine, Afghanistan, and North Korea. The economic cost of violence was equivalent to 68.6% of Ukraine's GDP.
Almost 70%.
Yeah, 53.2% for Afghanistan and 41.6% for North Korea. Just crippling figures.
When you break down the cost of armed conflict itself, what are the main drivers?
It's interesting, conflict-related displacement, so refugees and internally displaced persons, that accounts for over half, 56%. And GDP losses account for about a third, 34%.
So the human displacement is actually the biggest single economic cost driver within armed conflict itself.
In those specific calculations, yes. It highlights the massive ongoing burden of supporting displaced populations and the lost economic potential.
It really drives home that the price of peace is far, far less than the cost of conflict.
Right.
You mentioned military spending earlier. Who spends the most?
Well, the U.S. spends the most in total dollars annually. No surprise there.
Right.
But North Korea actually has the highest per capita spending, and Ukraine now has the highest military spending as a percentage of its GDP, given the current war.
And just to reiterate, IEP uses purchasing power parity, PPP, for these costs.
Correct. It's just a way to compare costs across countries more accurately, accounting for differences in what money can actually buy in different places. So we're comparing apples to apples, economically speaking.
Okay. All these numbers, all this data about decline, complexity, cost, it can feel incredibly heavy. Overwhelming, even.
It really can. It's easy to get lost in the sheer scale of the problem.
But the IEP doesn't just measure the problem, does it? They also offer a potential path forward, something they call positive peace.
And this is where it gets truly interesting and maybe a bit more hopeful.
Tell us about positive peace. What is it?
So positive peace isn't just the absence of violence. It's defined as the attitudes, institutions, and structures that actually create and sustain peaceful societies.
Okay, so the building blocks, like good governance, equitable resources, good relations with neighbors, that kind of thing.
Exactly, all those underlying factors. And what's truly fascinating is its predictive power.
Predictive. How so?
Positive peace metrics can actually be used to forecast future falls in peacefulness. So predict outbreaks of violence or instability with accuracy rates of up to 80%.
80%. That's huge.
Yeah.
So it raises a massive question, doesn't it?
It really does. If we know what factors lead to peace and we can measure them and they can predict conflict, can we actively build peace rather than just reacting after violence breaks out?
That's the crucial question. And the IEP's answer involves something they call the HALO process, using systems thinking. What exactly is this HALO framework? How does it help build peace?
Okay, so HALO is basically IEP's term for applying systems thinking to societal analysis.
Systems thinking, like looking at the whole picture, not just the parts.
Exactly. Imagine trying to solve a complex puzzle by only looking at one tiny piece. Systems thinking is the opposite. It's a holistic approach. Focuses on the connections, the relationships, the feedback loops within a whole system, a society, an economy, whatever it is.
Instead of just isolated components.
Right. And the strength of this approach is that it helps reveal patterns, those interdependencies, those crucial feedback loops. which allows for much better decision-making because you understand how changing one
And
thing.
have cascading effects everywhere else, ripple effects.
Precisely. You see the unintended consequences or the potential leverage points.
So it's not just simple cause and effect, like A causes B. It's more like a complex web where everything influences everything else.
It is. It's much more like biology or ecology than simple mechanics.
Okay, so how does this halo process actually work in practice? It sounds incredibly sophisticated.
It is quite involved. It starts with clearly defining the problem you're trying to tackle, then crucially bringing in diverse stakeholders for deliberation.
People on the ground.
People with direct on-the-ground knowledge, yes, their insights are vital.
Yeah.
This qualitative input is then combined with hard data. And then computer-based modeling is used
To do what? Simulate things.
to simulate the impacts of potential interventions, like what happens if we invest here, or what happens if there's an external shock, like a drought or an economic crisis.
Wow. And there are key concepts within this. You mentioned feedback loops.
Yeah, feedback loops are critical things that either reinforce a trend, making it spiral up or down, or balance it, keeping things stable. Other key concepts are momentum, the direction and pace of change in the system.
Like, is the situation getting better or worse, and how fast?
Right. Then path dependencies, how past decisions kind of lock you into certain future paths, like societal habits that are hard to break.
Okay.
And encoded norms, the unwritten rules that maintain stability, for better or worse. The core idea is that causality in these systems is complex, it's nonlinear, it's not always a straight line from A to B.
That sounds incredibly comprehensive. Can you give us a real-world example, something concrete that shows how this system's thinking, this halo process, has been applied?
Absolutely. There's a great example in the source material. IEP developed a model mapping the flow of individuals through a criminal justice system.
Okay, like from arrest to trial to prison and so on.
Yeah, including factors like crime rates, number of police officers, prosecutors, capacity of courts, prisons, even support services for rehabilitation, the whole system.
And what did the model show?
Well, in one scenario, it showed that if the number of active criminals the stock in systems terms surpassed a certain threshold, it could trigger a vicious cycle.
How so?
Increased crime would put more pressure on police, leading to lower retention rates, officers quitting or burning out. Fewer effective police could then lead to even more crime, which further lowers retention, eventually breaking the entire system. It couldn't cope.
So it could literally predict a potential collapse if certain thresholds were crossed. That's pretty sobering.
It is, but it also allows you to test solutions.
Right. What did they find when they looked for solutions within that model?
Well, in another scenario, the model demonstrated that by focusing on increasing police retention rates, maybe through better working conditions, higher salaries, mental health support, stress leave, things like that,
Okay.
the system could actually achieve a new state of stability even under those heightened crime rates.
So investing in the police officers' well-being and retention wasn't just good for the officers, it actually stabilized the whole system's ability to handle crime.
Exactly. It provided concrete, simulated evidence that this intervention could have a powerful ripple effect, stabilizing the entire justice system, not just improving one isolated metric like arrest numbers.
So what does this all mean for us then? This example really shows how understanding these deep system dynamics can help identify actual levers for change, right? Things that might not be obvious if you just look at surface symptoms.
Precisely. It helps build more resilient societies by looking at the whole picture and the interconnections. It's a truly hopeful counterpoint to all the challenging data on conflict trends we discussed earlier. It shows there are ways to think differently and act more effectively.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. We've navigated the complex, often challenging landscape of global peace.
We've seen the stark realities of increasing conflict, its changing nature, those massive costs.
But we've also explored this innovative framework of positive peace and systems thinking.
Yeah, the Global Peace Index highlights that increasing peace inequality and the surge in complex, interconnected conflicts. It's a tough picture.
It is.
Yet it also offers us this framework, this different way of looking at things through positive peace and systems thinking, a potential roadmap, perhaps, for addressing these profound challenges.
So our final provocative thought for you, our listener, building on everything we've discussed, is this.
Given that the GPI shows this widening peace inequality and these complex, tangled conflicts,
Yet it also offers the tools of positive peace and systems thinking. How might understanding these underlying societal dynamics empower us, not just as observers watching the news?
but potentially as agents of change?
Exactly. How can understanding these dynamics help us redirect these vicious cycles we see toward a more peaceful future? Something for you to think about.